Hey guys, tonight we begin with the kind of quiet that isn't empty. It's simply too tired to speak. A silence that hangs above packed dirt floors and weaves through the smoke curling from a hearth, too small to chase away the cold. The kind of silence that settles over straw-stuffed bedding and in the gap between footsteps, because even footsteps are precious when your body aches from survival. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing. Only if it feels right. Let me know where you're watching from. What time is it for you? This isn't the world of soap and perfumed water. It's not about fine linen folded on polished stone. It's about a woman kneeling beside a cracked wooden basin, pouring yesterday's rainwater through her hands, red from cold, thick with the scent of ash and lye. It's the sound of cloth being wrung out hard, with more care than ceremony. It's the man who scrapes his hands clean, not with a cleanser, but with the edge of a stone, the ritual of friction, not luxury. Here, filth wasn't just endured. Sometimes it protected you. Dirt lined the edges of life like mortar, sealing in warmth, holding out judgment. Too clean, and you might be thought vain, or worse, ungrateful. This was a world where hygiene meant something else entirely. A kind of quiet dignity. A resilience that didn't sparkle, but steamed gently beside the fireht. And so, tonight we travel not into the realm of kings and queens, not into castles with fountains that flowed in marble silence. No, we journey inward, into cottages where the walls breathe dampness and the air smells of onions, smoke, and old wool. Where cleaning the body was not a luxury, but a negotiation between the weather, the season, and what was left after. Work. Tonight's story isn't polished. It's soft around the edges, like an old towel, coarse, warm, worn thin by care. Let's begin where the soap never was, where ashes were more than remains. They were hope in powder form. Let's begin with Chapter 1. Ashes and elbow grease. It wasn't called cleaning, not the way we think of it now. There were no scented soaps, no gleaming tiles or steamy mirrors to fog, no bottles lined up like silent promises on a shelf. There was only what the fire left behind, and the will to make do with it. Ashes. They gathered in the hearth, pale and soft like ancient snow, after the last ember died and the cottage settled into darkness. But these were not waste. They were purpose, carefully swept, sifted with fingers stiff from cold, and stored in a wooden pail beside the door. Because tomorrow they would scrub skin just as they had scrubbed pots. Ashes were alkaline, gritty, and strangely sacred, mixed with water. Rainwater, if you were lucky. They became a primitive lie. Caustic to the skin, yes, but also cleansing. They left behind a strange, squeaky kind of clean, the kind you didn't question because you didn't know anything else. A woman might crouch by the fire in early morning light, when the frost still clung to the inside of the window glass, like lace. Her hands, red and cracked, would scoop the ash from the bucket and mix it in a bowl worn smooth with generations of scrubbing. The water would darken slightly, like weak tea. Steam would rise, and with a rag, not a cloth, not a towel, just an old piece of linen cut from a shirt long past saving, she'd begin to clean the face, the hands, the neck, the places people saw. That was enough. Because cleanliness wasn't about comfort. It was about decency, about not smelling so strong the neighbor turned away, about not letting your child's skin rash from too much dirt or too little care, about keeping lice just far enough at bay that you could sleep. If you're enjoying this, pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. The children were cleaned last, usually only if water was left. A quick rub down, behind the ears, under the chin, hair braided tightly to keep it from matting. And then the ash water, now cooled and gray, was poured outside. The earth drank it without judgment. Sometimes, on better days, there was vinegar. Or the ends of a bar of soap gifted by a neighbor, usually so laced with tallow and perfume that it made your eyes water. But that was rare, a festival thing, a once-a-winter thing. Mostly, there were ashes. And elbow grease, the kind of elbow. Grease that came from scrubbing the same rag over the same patch of skin for the 10th time, hoping it would lift the layer of farm work or chamber soot that clung too tightly. The kind that made your arms ache long before your heart softened. And still, people made it tender, mothers humming quietly while wiping behind ears. Lovers sharing the same bowl of water, each waiting their turn in silence. Elderly hands lifting. A grandchild's foot to clean it gently, as though remembering their own. There was a ritual to it, a rhythm, the way the bowl was always placed near the fire, because the warmth helped. The way a cloth was laid over the edge of the table so it wouldn't slip. The way someone always said, "This will do," when it was done. Not because it was perfect, but because it was enough. Sometimes the ashes stung. Sometimes they left red lines across the skin, especially if you'd added too much or scrubbed too hard. But people learned to balance it, to dilute the mix, to soften it with bits of moss or soapwort, if it was growing nearby. Nature gave what it could. Some swore by using sand. River sand, warmed in the sun. Others used old bread crusts or even wool scraps. Anything with a little texture. Anything that could lift the week's worth of survival from the skin without taking the skin with it. But ashes were always there. Reliable, free, humble. The same fire that cooked your soup and warmed your bed also helped clean your body. There was a strange poetry in that. A full circle. Warmth became waste. Waste became soap. There was no separation between the tools of survival and the tools of care. In the corner of the cottage, by the fire that never fully stopped smoking, sat a woman's basin, blackened at the bottom from years of warmth, rimmed with salt from dried water, stained with the color of effort. It wasn't pretty, but it was known. Generations of hands had bent over it, repeating motions so intimate they felt like prayer. And it wasn't just about cleaning skin. It was about clearing the day away. You'd scrub the soot from your arms and feel the weight of the hours fall. With it, you'd wash your feet and maybe, just maybe, feel a little less like the earth was swallowing you whole. When winter came, the ash bath was done in layers. First the hands, then the face, then maybe, if there was time, the arms. The body stayed mostly hidden, not just from modesty, but from cold. To strip bare in a one-room cottage was to tempt frostbite, not vanity. But in spring, when the sun stayed a little longer and the air lost its bite, people bathed deeper. Some even boiled water and let steam fill the cottage in gentle curls. It wasn't luxury, but it was something like forgiveness. You didn't expect to be clean. You just hoped to feel less heavy. By nightfall, the ash would be poured again into the hearth. This time, new flames would rise from old dust. And tomorrow, the ashes would be waiting, ready to clean, ready to burn, ready to begin again. It sat in silence, a small wooden basin, round and worn, just to the left of the doorway. Not grand, not new, not made to be admired, but in many ways, it held more memory than the walls around it, for hands, for faces, for the filth of the everyday, and the decency of trying anyway. The basin was always there. Its water changed with the seasons, icy in winter, slightly green in summer, often cloudy, and never enough. But the act of pausing by it, dipping your fingers in and wiping the weight of the world from your skin, that was something near, sacred, quietly repeated, rarely discussed. That it wasn't used for full baths. That was never its purpose. It was for greetings, for partings, for resetting the line between the world outside and the one you kept inside. A way to tell the dirt, you stop here. To mark the difference between fields and hearth, between labor and love. It often belonged to the woman of the house. Not in name, but in guardianship. She would be the one to fetch the water from the well or stream, carrying it in a clay jug. That leaned against her hip like a child too old to be held. She would warm it by the fire if there was time. She would pour it with care, swirling out yesterday's grime first, listening for the soft splash against the basin's curved walls, the same way her mother had. And her mother before that. And yet, it wasn't only for her. The man would stop there after his boots met the threshold, bending low, shoulders stiff from toil. He'd dip a cloth, sometimes just his sleeve, and wipe the sweat from his brow, the dust from his neck. Not to feel clean, but to feel human. Sometimes he'd sigh while doing it, not from exhaustion, but from the momentary peace it gave him. The water didn't cool his skin. It cooled his thoughts. Children learned the ritual early. Not taught, but shown. They watched and copied. A boy wiping mud from his cheek with a finger dipped in gray water. A girl smoothing down her hair, catching her reflection in the still surface, only to see it ripple and vanish. The basin was a mirror that never judged. If guests arrived, not nobles, but neighbors or kin, the basin became a soft host. The water was refreshed if possible. A new cloth laid nearby, and though no one said welcome, the basin did the speaking. It said, we expect dirt, but we offer care. It said, clean yourself, not for us, but for your own comfort. And if someone refused to use it, that too was noted. Silently. Suspicion often clung harder than mud. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. In winter, the basin iced over. Thin sheets of frost clinging to the rim. Fingers dipped in hesitantly, then quickly pulled back. Water flung across the floor like glitter from pain. Still, they used it. Even when the cold burned sharper than the dirt. Sometimes, in the deep dark of night, it caught moonlight. Just a sliver. Just enough to glow faintly, like the eye of something old and patient watching from the shadows. It reminded those who passed it to be gentle, to be grateful, to not waste what little water had been brought in. The cloth beside it, often only one, changed slowly. Not laundered often, not because people were lazy, but because water was precious and soap rarer still. It hung on a nail or over the basin's edge, damp, slightly sour. But it did its work. Some families left herbs in the water when they had them. A sprig of rosemary, a few mint leaves, even onion skins. Not for fragrance, but for belief that certain smells chased sickness, that bitter things protected. That tradition had power. It wasn't superstition. It was strategy. The basin heard more than it saw. It heard hushed conversations, arguments that stopped the moment the door closed. It heard children being told to wash your hands before bread. It heard sighs from visitors who came too tired to speak, and it heard prayers murmured under breath, fingers cupping water and lifting it to lips not for drinking, but for peace. Holy days, the basin took on ceremony. Not grand, not showy, but there might be extra care in cleaning it. The water might be warmed longer. The cloth might be the nicer one, pulled from the bottom of the stack, and when faces were washed, they were washed slowly, as if to honor something unseen, as if to ready the soul through the skin. But mostly, it was just there, a background, character, taken for granted until it cracked, mourned in silence when it leaked, celebrated quietly when someone patched it with twine or beswax. It didn't make people beautiful, but it made them feel tended to. And there's something about that about tending that matters more than transformation. The basin didn't make dirt disappear. It just said, here's a place for the effort. Sometimes a child would place a flower in it, a daisy, a weed, a gift. It would float there until the petals wilted and the water turned cloudy. And no one would remove it too soon, because beauty deserved a little time, even in the mud dot at night. When the door was bolted and the fire was nothing but whispers of orange, the basin remained dot empty, maybe, but ready. And in that stillness, in that corner by the door, it held the day's end, like a bowl of echoes, like a soft promise, that tomorrow, no matter how dirty the world got, there would always be a place to wash it off. They didn't call it bathing, not out loud, not in the way we imagine, with scented steam and solitude. It was simply getting clean, or washing up, or just being warm enough to try. Because bathing, in the world of the peasant, was not a private affair. It was a balancing act between modesty, survival, and shared flame dot baths didn't come with candles and calm music. They came with the scraping of buckets on stone, with firewood that had to be begged from the forest or bartered from the neighbor who had just enough to share, with a tub, if you had one, hauled in from the barn or uncovered from where it was kept. Upside down and gathering spiders dot, it was always firelight that made the decision. The hearth was central. Yes, not just in design, but in hope. Glowed like a beating heart, refusing to give all its heat away at once. If it was a good day, someone had boiled water. Not enough to fill a tub. Just enough to soften the cold edge of well water, to turn shock into sigh. A bath was never full soak. It was a layering, a pouring, a wiping, a kneeling. The woman would go first. Not because she was first in rank, but because she was often the one to do the work. The heating, the fetching, the waiting. She'd slip behind a cloth curtain, or if there wasn't one, behind the trust of turned backs. Her dress would fall to the floor like a secret, and the fire would paint her skin in flickers of orange and gold. She would not look in a mirror. There wasn't one. She would not linger. Warm water cooled quickly. There was no soap. Only cloth and ash and a smooth stone she kept wrapped in a bit of wool dot. She would begin with the arms, then the chest, then the legs. Always in that order. The parts seen, the parts useful, the parts that carried the day. She would wash silently, maybe humming, maybe thinking, maybe nothing at all, just feeling the way warm water felt like kindness. She would wring the cloth dry, watch it steam, and press it to her cheeks like a blessing dot. Sometimes the children bathed together. A metal tub. One child, then another. The water darkening with each turn. A little splashing, a little giggling, until someone got too cold or too tired or too scolded. There was shame in being too naked for too long. Not because anyone said so, but because the walls were thin and the nights too full of listening. So they bathed quietly, quickly, gratefully. The firelight caught everything. It showed the patches in the floor, the curve of a shoulder, the wear on a knee dot. It wasn't forgiving, but it wasn't cruel dot. It flickered and danced and softened the edges of bone and skin. It made the old look young, and the young look like stories not yet told. If guests were present, baths waited. Cleanliness could not come at the cost of decency, and no one wanted to be remembered as the one who washed at the wrong time. Sometimes, if the weather was right and the water was plentiful, the tub was carried outside. A private bath beneath the sky, steam curling into stars. But only if there was trust. Only if no one was watching. Even then, bathing was less about being clean, and more about feeling human again. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Men bathed too, when they could. After long weeks in the field, when the dirt no longer looked like dirt, but like second skin. They scrubbed quickly, with hands calloused enough to know what mattered. They didn't talk about it. They just did it. Then poured. The water out behind the shed, where no one would step. Some said a good bath cured the soul. Others said it let in spirits. Either way, it was never taken lightly. Firelight made it bearable. It made a shivering body into something almost holy. There were times when someone would stay in the tub too long, eyes closed, chin resting on knees, steam rising, breath slowing. And though no one rushed them, they'd eventually rise, skin pruned, hair damp, heart soothed. It was not indulgence. It was recovery. Towels were rarely dry. Usually, they were whatever was clean enough. A shirt, a shawl, a blanket set aside. Sometimes they were warmed by the fire first. That perhaps was the truest luxury of all. Not the bath, but the towel afterward. A cloth that felt like home, held against skin that no longer bristled with cold. And afterward, there was bread, or soup, or just quiet, because a bath wasn't the end of the day. It was the soft space between work and sleep. You would sit near the fire, hair dripping, feet bare, the floor still cold, but your spine warm. You wouldn't speak. You wouldn't need to. Everyone knew what bathing meant. It meant you'd made it through another week, another harvest, another winter's day. And maybe tomorrow would be dirtier, harder, colder. But for now, your skin didn't itch. Your body didn't stink, and your soul, just barely, felt rinsed. The fire would crackle. The coals would sigh. The water in the basin would cool and settle. And the world, just for a moment, would be still. It was a gamble each time. The mixture was never exact. No measuring cups, no instructions in tidy print. Just memory, passed down through whispers. And trials. One handful too much ash, and it burned. Too little, and it did nothing at all. The word itself felt strong, sharp, like the liquid it described. Born from ashes and rain, stirred into being by hands that knew the balance between cleaning and damage. It started with a bucket. Ashes collected from the hearth, sifted to remove charcoal chunks, then packed tightly in a wooden barrel or clay pot. Rainwater was poured over it slowly, cautiously. And then time, the liquid that seeped out, yellowish, slick, strangely. Heavy was the lie. They called it soap water, but it had no scent of roses or lavender, only the aroma of ash and earth. The kind of smell that clung to the back of your throat, that stung your eyes if you leaned too close. Still, it worked. Clothes soaked in it came out lighter, not white. Never white, but less brown, less tired-looking. Skin washed with it felt. Stripped, raw, but undeniably changed. Women learned to test it by touch. Dip a feather. If it dissolved, too strong. Drop a potato slice. If it turned soft, just right. But often there was no feather, no potato to spare. So the hand became the measure, the sting, the teacher. To wash with lye was to accept discomfort. It was poured into a basin and mixed with a bit of fat, if you had it, leftover grease from cooking, or drippings skimmed from broth. This softened the bite, made a primitive soap when whipped and cooled. A paste, gray and uneven, but precious. Children weren't allowed near it, except to watch. And watching was its own kind of learning, seeing the way their mother's hands reddened after each washing day, how she blew on her knuckles without complaint. If clothes could speak, they might have screamed. Beaten against rocks, scrubbed, with ash soaked in lye, rinsed in cold water that left them stiff as bark. But afterward, hung across lines of rope or draped over hedges, they fluttered like prayer flags. Tired, but clean. Cleansed, not coddled. And skin? Skin bore the brunt of it all. Elbows cracked, palms itched. Sometimes there were rashes, little red blooms across the arms or behind the knees, but people carried it like proof. You scrub it because you cared. You burned because you were clean. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Men used lye differently, more often for tools, for degreasing, for stripping rust from a blade, or cleaning grease from a trap. They respected it, feared it a little. But women, they wielded it. In the domestic universe, lye was both sword and salve, a weapon against grime, a cure for stink, and sometimes, quietly, a punishment. Not every peasant had the skill. There were burns that never quite healed, and tailies always whispered of women who got the ratios wrong and paid the price. But when done right, the transformation was near miraculous. A shirt that had clung to sweat and mud became wearable again. A baby's cloth, once soiled, came out passable enough to touch skin. The danger never stopped them, because lye was something alive. It moved, changed, bit back when disrespected. And in a world with few certainties, it offered one. Dirt didn't win. Not entirely. The lye barrel was kept in the corner, away from fire, away from animals, covered with cloth, sometimes sealed with wax if mice had found interest. It wasn't touched daily, only on washing days, only when something or someone needed renewal. Some households had better techniques, passed down, perfected. A recipe of sorts, though never written down. 3 scoops of this ash, 4 pours of that rain. Stir with a birch branch, not pine. Let it sit for half a day, no more. Others guessed, and still managed, because necessity made chemists of them all. And yet, no one romanticized it. There was no pride in lye burns, no joy in red knuckles, only the quiet knowing you'd done your best with what you had. Even the church acknowledged its power. Clothes were expected to be clean for holy days, for weddings, for funerals. Not spotless, never that, but clean enough to show care. And if that meant lye and pain, so be it. The soul was not the only thing worth cleansing. Some seasons made it harder. Winter meant less water, less ash, less patience. Summer made the smell worse, the sweat stickier, the effort doubled. But still they stirred. Still they soaked. Sometimes, when the lye ran out or burned too hot, they turned to soapwort, a plant that foamed when crushed and soaked. It was gentler, but it took longer. And time, in those days, was not something anyone owned in excess. In rare cases, someone might trade for real soap, imported, hard, wrapped in cloth like treasure. It would be used sparingly, a sliver shaved into water, a few bubbles cupped. Like magic, it smelled of tallow and something faintly floral, and it reminded you, sharply, that somewhere out there, someone bathed without pain. But you had lye, and strength, and a basin that steamed when you poured the mixture in, and a body that bore it. Clean wasn't gentle. It wasn't easy, but it was yours. And as the last shirt was wrung out, as the water drained into dirt, as the hands were dried on a corner of the apron, the world felt, even for a moment, renewed. Not softened, not scented, but strong. And that was enough. Towel, in the medieval peasant world, was not a towel. Not in the way we imagine, fluffy, white, folded neatly on a shelf. It was a rag, a repurposed hem, a strip of linen that had once belonged to something else or someone else, and now lived its second life drying skin instead of covering it. And even then, it wasn't always enough. One cloth might serve a whole family. It hung beside the fire, if there was room, damp more often than dry, smelling faintly of ash, sweat, and use. It was padded against skin, not rubbed. Rubbing would tear it. And if it was stiff from old water, You softened it with your hands before it touched your face. Clean was a generous word. Dry was a miracle. But the cloth did what it could. And you learned to be grateful for even the half-dry swipe across your back after a basin wash. Because water could chill you faster than dirt ever did, there was a ritual in the drying. You stood close to the fire, steam rising from your skin. The rag in your hands, you moved slowly, over shoulders, down arms, around knees. You did not rush, not because it felt good, but because warmth was a fleeting thing, and drying was the last gift the bath would give. Sometimes you'd share it, a mother drying a child, a wife drying a husband's back with hands rough but careful. Not a moment of passion, just tenderness. A towel could be an act of love. If it was winter, the drying took longer. Skin prickled, toes curled. You wrapped yourself in whatever you had, a cloak, a dress, a blanket that smelled of hay and smoke. But it was the rag that made the moment real. That said, you've finished. You've cared. And if there was no rag, then you air-dried clothes. To the hearth, arms wrapped around yourself, watching the fire and waiting for the feeling to return to your fingers. The air carried cold like a secret, but the flames made a boundary between you and the chill, between now and what came next. There was no embarrassment in nudity here, not if it came from need. Shame lived elsewhere, in vanity, in pride, in pretending you didn't need the same rags everyone else used. In some homes, the drying cloth was never washed. It was simply dried again and again, its history layered like bark. If it got too foul, it was burned, not thrown out. Fire was the final cleaning, but more often they were saved until there was a full day for washing. Towels, linens, undergarments, all boiled, beaten, and strung up like flags of ordinary survival. And so the towel lived many lives. It might start as a curtain, then a shirt, then a swaddle, then a cloth to clean the table, and finally a towel. And even then, perhaps later, it would become a bandage, or kindling, because nothing was ever just one thing, even dirt. Dirt was a blanket, not metaphorically, truly. The floor, packed with earth, held heat when the fire burned low. It was swept, yes, with birch branches or worn-out brooms, but not too clean, not too often. A little grime helped, kept drafts at bay. And when you slept close to the ground, a thin layer of dirt was the difference between cold toes and waking up still whole. Walls were smeared with mud and straw, not painted, not polished. This sealed the wind out and kept warmth in. Even the cracks were filled with it, not because they loved the look of brown smears, but because it worked. Filth in this world was not failure. It was function. Children with dirt-streaked faces were not neglected. They were alive, playing, helping. Too clean, and people asked questions. What are they trying to prove? A little mess was honest. Some even smeared soot across the seams of their clothes, especially in winter. Not to look poor, but to trap heat. Ash in the hem kept the cold from creeping up. And if it stained your skin, well, better that than frostbite. Warmth didn't come from wool alone. It came from knowing when not to clean. And yet, when spring arrived, there was always a reckoning. The rugs were shaken. The floor was dug up and leveled again. The drying rags, brittle from the cold, were replaced. And for a few days, the cottage smelled faintly of freshness. Not the kind that came from flowers, the kind that came from effort. From dragging the tub outside and letting it bake in the sun. From soaking the cloths in river water until the stains gave up and the fabric sighed. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. But even then, the rags came back. Even after, The best washing, they were still thin, still worn at the corners, still more whole than whole, and no one minded, because in the rhythm of peasant life, the rag had become a constant. Like the fire, like the basin, like the soft hush that followed. A day of work dried tears as often as it dried skin. It wiped counters, cleaned children, wrapped bruises. It held in it the scent of everything, and that was part of its power. Because in a world without perfumes or soap, memory was made of touch and smell. You knew your mother's cloth by feel. You knew the towel used for guests, slightly less coarse, less stained. You knew which rag had been your baby wrap, and which had been your father's shaving cloth. And as the sun dipped below the thatched roof, as the fire leaned into its final breath, you'd hang the rag by the fire, still wet, still useful. It didn't need to be folded, or blessed, or even thanked, just left there, ready, because tomorrow there would be more washing, more warming, more kneading, and the rag, like the dirt, like the warmth it made possible, would still be there, quiet, faithful. Enough. Hair was not vanity. It was trouble. It itched. It tangled. It caught smoke and held on to the scent of onions and fire. For days, it was something you lived with, not something you styled. For peasants, hair was not a canvas for beauty. It was a battleground, and the enemy had a name, lice, not spoken aloud with shame, because shame required surprise. And no one was surprised by lice. It wasn't a matter of if, but when. Even the cleanest heads were homes to things that crawled. Mother would know before the child complained. She'd see the scratching, the restlessness. She'd hear the sound in her sleep, fingers raking through hair in the dark, like restless mice in the thatch. And in the morning, she'd reach for the comb, not made of ivory or horn, like the wealthy had. Just carved wood, dark from years, of oil and use. Its teeth were close together, fine enough to catch what didn't belong. Its handle worn smooth by repetition. This comb had history. It had passed through generations. It had seen births, deaths, weddings, fevers. It had pulled back hair before meals and cleaned scalps before holy days. It was a thing of use, and strangely, of affection. The ritual began near the fire. The child sat on a stool, back straight, still. The mother knelt behind. She would oil the hair first, if there was oil to spare. Olive, goose fat, even lard, anything slippery. It made the job easier. Helped the comb glide. Helped the bugs slide free. Then, slowly, she would begin. From scalp to ends, again and again. Each pull was firm, but careful. Too fast, and the comb snagged. Too slow, and it missed what needed to be found. The firelight caught each stroke. The silence between mother and child was not awkward. It was old. A silence that said, "I've done this before, and I'll do it again." Sometimes there would be a wince, a yelp, tears, but not always from pain. Sometimes it was just the tiredness of being tended to, of having someone care that deeply, that gently. The lice were caught on the comb's teeth, wiped onto a cloth, sometimes squished, sometimes drowned in vinegar if there was any left. It wasn't pleasant, but it was necessary, and in its own quiet way, it was love. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Hair was washed rarely. There wasn't enough water, and too much wetness invited cold. Instead, it was brushed, oiled, braided. Braiding wasn't fashion. It was survival. It kept the hair from matting, kept it out of food, out of fire, out of trouble. Women braided each other's hair, mothers, daughters, sisters. And in that act was comfort. You didn't need to speak to someone whose braid you tied. You could feel their mood in the tension of their shoulders. You could tell if they were sick or sad, or hungry, just by the way they sat. And the braid, always tight, always neat, said, "I saw you." I took time. Men kept their hair shorter. Not shaved, just simple. Some tied it back with leather cord. Some let it grow, wild and tangled, because it didn't matter. But even they knew the itch. Even they had moments at night when they pulled their fingers through their hair and sighed. The wooden comb was not always enough. Sometimes, if the infestation was bad, a remedy was made. Boiled herbs, rosemary, thyme, nettle. The water cooled and poured over the scalp. The smell sharp. And honest, sometimes it worked. Sometimes not. And when the comb cracked, there was mourning, because it had lived in the family for years, had been carved by a grandfather, had seen babies cry and old women smile. Making a new one wasn't easy. Wood had to be chosen carefully, hard but not brittle, carved with a knife, kept for only the most careful jobs. The teeth shaped one by one, thin, even, unforgiving of error. Some combs had symbols carved into them, marks to keep evil away, to confuse the lice, or so it was believed. Magic lived in the details. Protection in the pattern. Hair meant more than hygiene. A girl's braid told you her age. A married woman covered hers. A widow let it hang loose, like mourning in silk strands. And in rare moments of rest, festivals, weddings, harvest dances, hair was adorned, with ribbons if you had them, with flowers if you didn't, even with bits of thread dyed from beetroot or berries. Just for one night, just for the joy of it. But in the quiet corners of daily life, the hair was tied, combed, cleaned with care, and the comb, resting by the basin or on the windowsill, waited. It would be used again tomorrow. To check for lice, to smooth a plate, to calm a frightened child. And when a new baby was born, someone would say, "Bring the comb," not for cleaning, but for continuity, because every thread of life, even the ones that itched, was still a thread, still worth untangling, still worth tending. And in the hands of the quiet, patient, overworked, the comb became something holy. Not for what it did, but for how often it was picked up with love. It wasn't considered unclean. The smell, it was simply life, hanging in the air, woven into clothes, tucked behind the knees and under the arms. The scent of a peasant's body was not masked, not apologized for. It was accepted, expected, a part of the person, like their hands or their shadow. The cottage smelled of many things. Damp wood, boiled cabbage, smoke that never fully left the air, and bodies warm, moving, always working bodies. Sweat was the perfume of labor, not something to be washed off as soon as it appeared, but something that came and went with the seasons, the work, the meals. In winter, it clung closer, mixed with wool, sealed by tight corners and low ceilings. In summer, it drifted outdoors with the steam of the soil. To smell of yourself was not shame. It was proof. You had worked. You had endured. You were still. Here. The idea of scent as offense, as failure, belonged to another world, one with perfumes and powders and space. In the cottages of the poor, scent was shared. If you lived among animals, you smelled of them. If you slept near the hearth, your hair carried the trace of wood smoke. If you cooked onions, your skin wore them until the next rain. And yet people tried, not with soap, but with herbs. Basil in the folds of a dress, sage crushed and tucked into a pocket, mint leaves rubbed on the wrist, a gesture more spiritual than hygienic. It didn't change everything, but it helped. It said, "I care, even when I can't." Clothes weren't washed often. Water was too scarce. But they were shaken, aired, hung in sunlight like prayers. Sunlight was a cleaner. So was wind. A shift might be turned inside out. A shawl beaten with a stick to release the dust. Not pristine, not spotless, but fresher, lighter. Enough that children carried their own version of the scent, sweeter somehow, of earth and hay and sleep, and the occasional sharp trace of milk or mud or mischief. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. There were customs too. Wiping the neck before entering another's home, changing into a slightly cleaner tunic for church, covering the head when cooking so hair didn't carry the meat smell all day. And on feast days, people made efforts, washing with vinegar if they had it, rubbing damp cloths under their arms, boiling rosemary and leaning over the steam, as if scent could be inhaled into decency. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but the attempt mattered. Men smelled stronger. They were expected to. Fields, sweat, leather, ale. It was the musk of the masculine. And if he smelled of nothing, people wondered, was he ill? Women's scent was quieter, not hidden, just folded inward. Hair carried the smell of whatever was cooking. Aprons bore the scent of flour, yeast, sometimes blood. Smell was memory. You knew your mother by it, even in the dark. You knew if someone had been in the fields or near the fire. You knew who had slept in which bed. The nose told stories before the mouth ever did, and there were scents that meant danger got mold, rot, the sharpness of illness, like metal or sour milk, a baby's breath gone wrong, a man's sweat turning bitter from fever, the scent of fear on a woman's skin when the knock came too late at night. But there were comforting smells too. Baked bread, fresh rushes laid on the floor, the skin of a loved one warmed by the fire. Clean, not because of soap, but because of familiarity, because it was your scent, because in a world without fragrance, the body was its own weather. There were no candles to cover smells, only tallow, which added its own thick layer of scent. No perfumes, no sprays, just the body and its work dot, and still, people found ways. A dried orange peel kept for months. A sachet of lavender, gifted and never used, just opened and inhaled in secret. A piece of wool dipped in herbs and sewn into a collar, not to impress, but to uplift. To say, today I smell a little more like hope. They didn't need to be told they snowed. They knew, and they weren't ashamed, because to smell was to survive. And survival came first, even in love. Scent played its part. Lovers knew each other by it, in barns, in fields, in narrow beds, the scent of hair, of hands, of breath too close. Not roses, not musk, just real dot. If a man left and came back months later, you'd know him first by scent. Before you saw his boots, before he said your name, the body never forgot its own fragrance. And the mind, even in sleep, recognized the smell of home. Cottages smelled differently in the morning. Cool, still, the scent of sleep, and ashes and the faint salt of dreams. You'd open the door and let the outside in. Damp grass, smoke from a neighbor's chimney, and the new day full of its own smells yet to be named. And at night, you'd settle into the familiar. Blankets that smelled of straw, hair that still held the memory of cooking, pillows that carried every night before. You'd breathe it in, not always pleasantly, but always knowingly. And as the fire dimmed and the night grew full, the smells would blend together into one quiet, steady reminder. You're alive. You're not clean, not the way others might define it, but you're whole. And that's something. The stream was not a river. It didn't roar. It didn't flood fields or carry boats. It murmured. It whispered through roots and stones, winding like a secret path beside the village edge dot. It was shallow, often muddy, rimmed with grass and nettles. But it was enough. Enough to wash. Enough to kneel beside. Enough to be something more than stillness. Something that moved when the world felt too stuck. Women came to it with baskets. Arms full of linens and rags and shirts worn thin. The stream didn't judge what they brought. It simply made space. There was no schedule. No marked day for washing. Just the rhythm of need. When the pile grew too high, when someone was sick, when holy day was near, then it was time. They knelt on the bank, skirts hitched, hands red from cold. They worked in silence or in murmurs, not gossip, exactly. More like weather reports of the soul. She's still coughing. He's taken to the ale again. The baby slept last night. And the stream carried it all away. Not just the dirt, but the words. It listened without reply. There was comfort in that. In speaking to something that didn't interrupt. Something that kept moving, no matter what. The stones were smooth from use. Flat ones for scrubbing. Rounded ones for sitting. A child might lie across one, belly down, watching water twist through moss. Learning in the most patient way. How time works. Soaps were rare, but sometimes herbs were brought. Soap worked if the season was right. Ash paste if there was any to spare. Cloth was slapped against the stone, again and again. The sound sharp but familiar. Thwack, lift, rinse, repeat. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. The stream accepted everything. Blood from births. Milk from claws used to clean. Sweat, grease, even the bitter traces of grief. A shawl soaked in tears, rinsed and wrung and never spoken of again. Sometimes a woman would stop mid-wash and just sit, elbows on knees, hands idle, eyes watching, the current thinking, remembering, or simply resting because the stream was one of the few places where no one asked questions. You were allowed to be quiet. You were allowed to be tired. Children played nearby, throwing sticks, wading ankle deep, learning to avoid the sharp stones and where the leeches liked to cling. There were songs, too, simple, low melodies, some with words, some just hummed. Sound meant to soothe the water as much as the self. And when one woman sang, others listened, not always joining in, but feeling it. The water wasn't clean, not by today's rules. It carried dirt from every washing, silt from upstream, the occasional frog or fish darting past. But it felt clean. Cool, moving, alive. And so the cloths came out fresher, not spotless, but lighter. Stiff at first, then soft again when dry. Smelling not of flowers, but of wind. Some women spoke to the stream like a friend. Take it, will you? Don't bring it back. Tell no one what you saw. And the stream, ever flowing, ever hushed, kept its word. It never told. Clothes were laid on bushes or flat rocks to dry. Children lay beside them, watching clouds, whispering dreams into the sky. And mothers wrung their hands dry, wiped, faces with sleeves, and turned for home. Sometimes, when someone passed, a piece of their clothing was brought here one last time. Washed not because it was dirty, but because the act itself was part of letting go. A way to say, you wore this, you lived. Even in grief, the stream remained the same. It didn't speed up, didn't slow, just carried water and memory forward. In spring, it ran fuller, faster, too fast, sometimes, making the banks slippery, the stones dangerous. Children were kept back. Mothers stayed cautious. In summer, it thinned, and women dug little hollows with their hands, deep enough to soak. A rag to rinse a cloth. In winter, it froze. Thin sheets of ice crusting over, then cracking at midday. Washing was postponed, or done at home, with buckets heated by the hearth. Heavier, harder, lonelier. But when the stream was open, it was chosen, not just for water, for company, for the sound, for the gentle reminder that something in this world always moved forward. The men rarely came, only to fetch water, only when the well was dry. This place was held by women, by their voices, their hands, their quiet laughter, by the way they looked after each other without naming it. If a woman showed up with a bruise, the others did not ask. But someone offered her a better stone. Someone laid a clean cloth across her shoulder. Someone sang. The stream did not judge. And neither did they, because everyone brought something to the water. Something stained, something tired, something that needed letting go, and the stream, faithful, cold, and kind, carried it all, so the linens would dry. The baskets would empty. The sun would slip down past the trees, and the last one to leave would look back at the water, at the stone, at the soft ripples that never stopped, and whisper, "Thank you," as if the stream heard, as if the stream knew. And maybe it did, It was not spoken of in polite company, but everyone did it. Even saints had to squat. Even nobles had to go. And for the peasant, the matter of relieving oneself was not about privacy, but proximity to cold air, to shame, and sometimes to the dark edge of illness. There were no toilets, no flush, no seat, no door to lock. There were pits, dug in haste or with care, depending on the season. And there were buckets, wooden, often leaky, with handles that stuck and rims that cracked. A pit was dug just far enough from the cottage not to invite stink, but not so far that walking to it in the night became a danger. A balancing act of odor and safety. It was often ringed with stones, or planks if you were lucky. Sometimes a little thatch screen was built around it, a curtain of sorts, flapping in the wind, barely a comfort. The act was done quickly, pants down, eyes up, always listening, not just for animals or people, but for the cold wind sneaking under your clothes, and afterward, a handful of ash, or soil, or leaves, to cover what was left, to keep flies at bay, to pretend dignity in. Winter, the ground froze. The pit became a bucket, used in corners, behind blankets, beside beds. It was emptied at dawn, or before anyone else was awake, or not at all, until the smell insisted. No one liked the bucket, but it was better than frostbite, better than being caught in the snow with your dress around your knees. There was modesty, even in that. People turned away, coughed to cover sound, pretended not to notice the trip outside with the cloth bundle in hand. The act itself was humble and humbling, a reminder that every body, no matter how clean or strong, had needs that couldn't be delayed forever. Children learned early where to go, when not to ask, how to wipe with moss or straw or nothing at all. They asked questions once. Why do we do this here? Why not inside? But the answer was always the same. This is how it's done. Because there was no other way. And so they learned how to crouch without falling, how to hold your breath, how to listen for footsteps. There were jokes, of course, between brothers, between friends, laughter in the fields when someone slipped or shouted or dropped something precious in the wrong hole, because humor was a salve. And even in the business of waste, people looked for a way to make it bearable. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Women had it harder. Their clothing, their modesty, their safety, all made the act more complex. And so they went in pairs, when possible, to the hedgerow, to the tree line, to a place known but never marked. There were places you didn't go, too open, too close, to the road, Too near the Lord's estate. The body wasn't shameful, but being seen, that was. Not because of the body, but because of the story it invited. Whispers, looks, blame. So modesty was a kind of armor. Thin, fragile, but worn every day. The bucket indoors was its own world. It was covered when not in use, with cloth, with a lid, with hope. Its smell was part of the cottage, like smoke, or stew, or feet. Not pleasant, but familiar. Children sometimes knocked it over. Men grumbled about its presence. Women emptied it more often than not, because someone had to. And waiting too long made things worse. There was no soap for hands afterward. Just water. Maybe vinegar. Maybe nothing. But hands were wiped, always on aprons, on skirts, on the sides of thighs. Not clean, but not ignored. Some kept a bucket of ash nearby, to sprinkle after each use. Ash absorbed the smell. Ash pretended. It wasn't there. Sometimes, on warmer days, the pit was deepened. The earth turned and refilled, the old spot left behind like a buried secret. A circle of flattened grass. A memory. Others, those who lived near the forest, used the trees. The roots became footrests. The bark, a backrest. And the leaves, always useful. Animals used the same ground, so no one felt above it. Everyone left something behind, and the world continued. Illness often started there. Contaminated water. Dirty hands. No one spoke of it, but everyone feared it. So they tried. They poured water where it mattered. They warned children. They boiled when they could. They kept the bucket clean, cleaner than anything else, not because they loved the task, but because they knew its power. A clean bucket might save a winter. A well-placed pit might spare a neighbor. Dignity was fragile. Health even more. And yet it laughed. At the smell, at the slips, at the things lost to the bottom of the pit and never recovered. Because laughter, in that space, was resistance. Modesty wasn't silence. It was knowing when to look away, when to offer help, when to pretend nothing had happened at all. And so the buckets were emptied. The pits were dug again. The cloths were used, washed, reused, and no one spoke of it unless they had to. Because some things, when spoken, lose their tenderness, their dignity. And dignity, even in this, perhaps especially in this, was worth keeping. It began with motion. Before sun, before speech. A body rising from straw, joints stiff with cold, eyes still heavy. And then the day. Work was not optional. It was breath. It was gravity. It pulled you from rest and carried you through fields, kitchens, forests, and barns. And with it came sweat. Not the kind that glistened on brows in paintings. Not the kind wiped delicately with silk. This sweat was honest. Born of bent backs, of shovels and plows and kettles, too hot to hold. It darkened fabric. It made shirts cling, made sleeves heavy. It carved lines down spines and pooled in the hollows of knees. But in that sweat was something holy. Not sacred because it was clean. Sacred because it was real. You sweated through your doubts, through your hunger, through your grief. You sweated. Through cold, because sometimes only movement kept you from freezing. And through heat, because the sun was not a suggestion. It was a taskmaster. The body, pushed to the edge, found something strange there. Relief. Sweat cooled you. It proved you were still trying. It proved you were still here. There were no towels for it. No baths waiting at the end of labor. Only there. Wind, the scratch of wool. The moment you paused and let your skin steam like a pot left too long on the fire. The smell came quickly, but no one mentioned it. Because it was the same for all. And in that sameness was comfort. You smelled like sweat. Good. It meant you hadn't given up. Men in fields, sleeves rolled, sweat dripping from foreheads into earth. Women in kitchens, faces flushed, sweat at the nape of the neck, beneath scarves. Children chasing chickens, their sweat sweeter, less burdened, but no less earned. And sometimes, in the thick of work, between loads of hay or turns at the grindstone, a moment came. Stillness, not from rest, but from rhythm. The body moving perfectly, sweat flowing freely, pain forgotten. And in that moment, salvation not from sign, but from heaviness. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. There was a kind of prayer in it, not spoken, but breathed. In, out, push, pull, hands blistered, but strong, feet aching, but moving. And the sweat said, "You can keep going. You are still enough." Some days, there was no water to drink, so the body drank itself, recycled its salt, its heat, its fire. And at the end of the day, you collapsed not dirty, but gleaning. Yes, dirt clung. Yes, flies followed. Yes, shirts were soaked in crusted. But beneath it all, something was working. Sweat flushed sickness. It carried away fever. It loosened grief. Cried, sometimes, and couldn't tell where the tears ended and the sweat began. And when someone passed, a neighbor, a mother, a child, the sweat still came, because you still moved, because you still needed to cook, to fetch, to tend. And somehow, the body knew. That sweat could carry sorrow too. The cottage held that scent. Not unpleasant, not pleasant. Just real. It lingered in blankets, in corners of rooms where work was done, on the handles of tools, in the folds of aprons. And it told a story. We worked today. We tried. At night. It cooled, left salt behind. You licked your lip, and it tasted like effort. Sometimes someone wiped your brow. A lover, a friend, a child, and that gesture, that rag across the forehead, was more tender than any poem. Even holy days could not escape it. People tried. They washed the day before. They wore their least dirty clothes. But in the pews, sweat still pooled behind knees. Under arms. And God, it was believed, understood, because sweat was not sin. It was sacrifice. When illness came, sweat became omen. The fever-slick brow, the chilled shiver after, a body fighting itself. And even then, they did not fear sweat. They feared what it meant, but they trusted it, let it run. Let it carry the sickness out. Let it save, if it can. Some women rubbed salt into sore muscles. Others used vinegar, but mostly, they just waited. The body knew how to cool itself. The body, when left to try, often did. And when a child ran in, shirt soaked, cheeks red, no one scolded. They smiled. They wiped the child down and let them rest in a patch of shade. Because sweat was the work, speaking. It said, "I've done something. I'm still alive." Even in love, it showed up. Two bodies, close, under blankets, behind barns. No one spoke of it, but they remembered. The slickness of skin, the warmth of closeness, the way sweat made everything feel realer, heavier, more true. No perfume, no polish, just breath and skin. And salt. The body, stripped of anything unnecessary. Only what mattered. And so, when people lay down at night, too tired to wash, too spent to care, they did not feel shame. Their bodies were damp, their sheets damp too, but the fire crackled, and the sweat cooled. And something in them said, "You did enough." Sleep came easily then. Not always, but often. Because the body, bathed in its own effort, had nothing left to hold. And in that quiet, in that rest, sweat dried. And the skin remembered the day. and forgave it. The blade wasn't made for the face. It had gutted fish, cut rope, trimmed branches, but today it would find skin. And for a few minutes, it would become something else, a tool of precision. And of trust. There was no shaving cream, no warm towel, no mirror, not really. Maybe a reflection in a bowl of water, or the back of a spoon. More often, just feel. You shaved not for beauty, but for necessity. A beard too long gathered lice. A neck too hairy invited heat. A jaw left wild might mark you as lazy or worse, as having given up. The knife was sharpened slowly, patiently, against stone, against leather. A few strokes tested on a thumb, not for sharpness, but for intention. You didn't need it. Perfect. You needed it willing. And then came the choice. To shave yourself, or let someone else do it. Each had risks. To shave yourself was to feel the tremble in your own hand, to trust your own nerves, your own breath. One slip, and the day might bleed. To let another. That took a different kind of bravery. The stool was pulled near the fire, for light, for calm. You'd sit still, knees together, hands gripping the edge. And he, father, brother, friend, would lean in, knife in hand. Eyes narrowed not in threat, but in concentration. There was no talking. Not now. The silence was protection. The blade moved down the cheek. Slow, sure, drawn with care, not forced. Skin stretched tight, breath held. The sound faint, like cloth tearing softly. Sometimes there was blood, but not always, if the knife was good, if the angle was right. And when it ended, relief. A cloth, dampened with cold water, was pressed to the skin. A sting, then a soothing. Then the strange, almost childlike feeling of your own clean shin. Shaving was not daily. It was not even weekly. It was for when you needed to be seen. For the Sabbath, for funerals. For weddings. To go unshaven too long was to fade into the background, to lose shape, to feel and appear unted. So men kept the knife in reach, wrapped in cloth, sometimes hidden from children. Always respected. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Young boys, watch closely how the blade moved, how their fathers set their jaws, how they didn't flinch. It was a right. More than that, it was inheritance. Not yet, they'd be told. Soon. And when soon came, a shaking hand met a trembling cheek. And a boy became something else. Not a man, not yet, but someone on the way. Women didn't shave, not in the same way, but they plucked, they trimmed, they smoothed what they could with bits of cloth, with hot water, with belief. Some used thread, others used broken shells. The goal was not bare skin, but managed skin. Less for beauty, more for comfort. And modesty. To be overly groomed was to invite comment. To be wild was to invite scorn. So they lived in the middle. They did what? They could. Some whispered of women who shaved like men, with knives, in secret, for reasons of their own. But they were spoken of only in candlelight, with awe and a little fear. Beards for men meant something. A new father might grow his out. A man in mourning might let his face go wild, as if the grief had to show up somewhere. But eventually the knife would return, not to erase, but to restore. Sometimes someone else would do it for you. After sickness, after sorrow, you'd sit weak, your eyes half closed, and hands would come. Gentle, sure, the knife would trace the line of the chin, of the jaw, of the neck, and when it was done, you'd feel like yourself again. Not new, but remembered. Shaving was not about the face. It was about claiming space, about saying, I am still here, still trying. And when the blade dulled, it was sharpened. When the hand shook, it steadied. Some men shaved in the woods, by streams, with birds watching. Others shaved in barns, with hay sticking to their ankles. A few had mirrors, tiny, cracked, spotted with age, but most just knew the map of their own faces. They didn't need to see Dot, they needed to feel. A smooth face met the world differently. A smooth face meant readiness, for the harvest, for the reckoning, for the kiss. And when night came, and the blade was wrapped again, and the skin tingled with the ghost of the knife, there was peace, not because it was clean, but because it was tended. Dot, and in the dark, when someone touched her face, they could feel it, the effort, the care, the steadiness it took. Dot, not just the nerves, but the choice. Dot, it began like a whisper, a hush across the fields, a soft pattering on the thatch above your head. Not loud, not violent, just enough to make the cottage lean in and listen. Rain. Not the kind that ruined plans, because there were no plans. Just the quiet list of things that must be done, and whether the sky would allow it. But when it rained, properly rained, something in the body loosened, because it meant water. And water, for the peasant, was never taken for granted. Buckets were dragged outside. Pots, bowls, wooden ladles laid bare under the sky. Children ran out with arms open, mouths wide, and even the animals turned their faces upward. Clean water, fallen from nowhere. There was no walking to the stream, no pulling from the well with a creaky rope, no waiting for someone to carry it home. It simply fell, and so they used it, not immediately, not wastefully, but with quiet gratitude. Hair was let down, faces tilted skyward. Shirts were peeled off, slowly, shyly, and the body was offered to the clouds. Rain did not judge. It didn't pause for modesty. It didn't care if you were poor, tired, or clothed in rags. It touched everyone the same, and that was rare. In the village, people were seen, ranked, judged. But under the rain, you were just skin, just breath, just warm enough to hope for more. Children bathed in it, in puddles, in rivulets that cut paths down the roads. They laughed, they slipped. They returned to the cottage soaked, muddy, glowing. And no one scolded, because they had been washed by something better than soap. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Clothes were beaten clean against stones while the rain fell, laid across hedges, rinsed again and again until the water ran clear. It was the one time no one cared if they got wet. They wanted to get wet. There was something holy in it. A woman would stand barefoot outside her cottage, let the rain soak her hair, close her eyes, feel the salt of her skin wash away, not because she was dirty, but because the rain offered something else. Forgiveness. It rained on roofs with holes, on boots with cracks, on blankets hung out to air. It rained on the sick and the healthy, on old wood and new love. Sometimes two people would step out together, hands brushing, heads ducked low, a shared nod. Let's be washed together. No words, just the sound of the rain between them. When it came during work, no one stopped. They just worked wetter, pulled weeds with rain running down their backs, milked goats while drops pinned off the tin pail. If anything, they moved faster, because wetness meant warmth later. It meant water later. It meant the ground softened. And when it ended, when it ended, the stillness afterward was louder than any storm. Clothes clung to skin, hair dripped. The fire inside hissed when wet logs were thrown on. And then came the best part. Drying. Not with towels, but with time, sitting by the fire, clothes steaming, skin pink, The air thick with the scent of wet wool and new earth. That was when you felt clean, not polished, not perfumed, just fresh, like you'd survived something small, and been changed by it. Rain was rare in some seasons, longed for, prayed for. It watered the crops, yes, but it also watered the soul, and when it didn't come, the skin felt tired, the house smelled stale. The rags never quite came clean. So when it finally returned, people stepped outside without thinking, hands open, chests lifted. Not to shout, not to dance, but to let go. To let it all run down their arms. To say, take this too, take the ache, take the grime, take the week I've carried in silence. And the rain always did. Sometimes it came at night. A whisper on the roof, a lullaby of droplets and wind, and those were the best nights, because you slept knowing the world was being washed while you rested, because you woke up to buckets full, an air that smelled like new. Even the chickens seemed calmer, the dogs slept deeper, the baby fussed less. Rain changed things. It made the world feel gentler, more willing, and afterward, the sun would return, not in anger, but like a friend who'd stepped out during the storm and come back clean. And everything, the pots, the ground, the people, would glisten. Just a little, not enough to blind, just enough to remember that even without soap, without tubs, without linen or lotion or lavender, there was still a way to be washed. To be touched by something soft, to be forgiven by the sky. They didn't own many. One tunic, maybe two. A dress for every day, and another for feast days, if the years had been kind. Clothes were not fashion. They were function, layers against the cold, barriers against the wind, proof you had something left to wear. And they wore the dirt proudly, not because they loved filth, but because it meant they were still working, still moving. A shirt dark with soil was a badge. A skirt hem streaked with ash was a memory of the field, of the hearth, of the child lifted with muddy feet. Clean clothes didn't stay clean for long, not in cottages with earthen floors. Not when your job was to kneel, to stir, to carry. So the dirt stayed, not just on the outside, but in the seams, in the threadbare places under the arms, in the fold of the collar where sweat had soaked again and again. These clothes were not discarded when stained. They were patched, re-stitched with thread pulled from something older still. A knee patched with a square from a baby blanket. A shoulder mended with cloth from a sibling's burial shroud, softened by tears and time. There was no shame in repairs. There was shame only in pretending you didn't need them. You wore the dirt until it told your story, until someone could look at your tunic and say, "You've had a hard week." Or, "That's cabbage water," with a small, knowing smile. The stains told on you, but gently, and you let them, because clothes were not supposed to look new. They were supposed to hold, and when they no longer held, they became something. A towel, a wrap for bread, a lining for a cradle. No thread was ever wasted. Children's clothing told a faster story. Torn knees, sticky sleeves, shirts handed down until the original owner was forgotten. A girl might wear a dress first made for a boy, hemmed shorter each spring. A boy might wear breeches once worn by a man long buried, tied at the waist with string, and no one minded, because the fabric still held warmth, and warmth was what mattered. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. On feast days, people washed, laid their best or least worn on, the grass to dry, pulled out the shirt without holes, the cloak without too much smell, and still they came to church with dirt at the edges, because the road was muddy, because the walk was long, Because the world did not wait for your sleeves to stay white, some tried harder, boiled their linen in lye, scrubbed the cuffs with sand, beat shirts on rocks until they whispered of effort. But even then, even at their best, the clothes wore the memory of the life they lived in. There were no wardrobes, no closets, just pegs by the fire, hooks by the door, and chests, if you had one, where winter things waited their turn. Wool was worn until it thinned like breath, linen until it frayed at the neckline and the wrists. And underclothes, those closest to the body, were more precious than gold, not because they were lovely, but because they offered the illusion of privacy. Sometimes a woman would sit by the fire, a pile of clothes in her lap, a needle in hand, her fingers tracing. Holes in fabric like old scars. She wouldn't speak, but each stitch said, "I care. This matters. This will last another week." And when clothes were beyond patching, truly gone, they were burned. Ashes returned to the hearth. Threads to smoke, no waste, no forgetting. Some saved a single piece, a button, a string, to remember. Because clothes weren't just worn. They were held, shared, buried with, married in. A baby wrapped in a piece of her grandmother's apron. A bride wearing a shawl that smelled of her mother's cooking. A man buried in the shirt he wore to every harvest. Clothes told you who you were, not by their cut or color, but by their texture, by their weight. Was it thin from wear? Stiff with salt from sweat? Soft from washing? Or stiff from neglect? The answer whispered who you belonged to, what you had done, where you had stood in the story. And when night came, and the shirt was pulled off over the head, hung by the fire to dry, or simply laid across a stool, it wasn't discarded. It was rested not, because tomorrow it would be worn again, and tomorrow's dirt would join yesterday's. And somehow that layering of days, of labor, of life, made the cloth feel stronger, as if the fabric itself remembered how much had been endured in it. Cleanliness was not the goal. Continuance was. And when a stranger passed through the village, you didn't judge him by the brightness of his tunic. You judged him by how it moved, by how it creased at the elbows, by the way it clung to the spine, or hung loose at the belly dot. You judged him by how well it lived on him, and you knew, he's been walking long. He's not from here. He's carrying something heavier than bread, because cloth, like people, carried. Weight dot it stained. It softened. It survived dot, and in that survival, there was beauty. Not beauty like lace or gold, but the beauty of what keeps going, of what still wraps around a body. Even when the world unravels, they didn't make it. They found it, or more truthfully, they were given what was left. A sliver, a crumb, a piece no longer wanted by the hands that lived above them. Dot soap, dot not the soft, gray paste stirred from ash and fat in peasant homes. Not the sharp lye that burned and cleaned at once. This was real soap, hard, cold, bitter to the tongue and slick to the touch. Dot. It came from the manor, from the kitchen, or the laundry room, or the lady's own chambers, not as a gift, but as waste, when the pot had been scraped, when the trimmings had hardened too far to mold into polite shapes, when the scented soaps had slumped at the edges. Then, perhaps, a kitchen girl would wrap it in cloth, slip it into her apron, pass it silently to someone waiting by the back door. Dot. And so the peasants got their soap, not often, not much, but enough. Dot. Enough to make a basin shimmer, enough to rub between the fingers and feel, for a moment, like the grime might truly lift away. Dot. It smelled strange. Not bad, just unfamiliar. Bay leaf, sometimes, tallow and flowers. Sometimes, lavender or marjoram, or something you couldn't name, but longed to smell again. Dot it felt like visiting a place you'd never be invited to. The Lord's kitchen was another world. Dot bright, hot, full of things the village would never taste. But the soap, that sliver of it, crossed the border, into hands cracked from winter, into rags stiff with dirt, into wooden bowls half full of hope. Children whispered when it appeared. They'd gather round, wide-eyed, watching their mother rub the little bar between her palms. It foamed, just slightly. Not like in stories, but enough. A lace of bubbles, the size of ants, and those bubbles were magic. For once, you didn't smell of onion or smoke or yourself. For once, you smelled clean. Not just washed, transformed. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. But they used it carefully, a tiny bit at a time, wrapped tightly in cloth when not in use, kept high away from rats and rain, stored in boxes meant for letters or berries or the rarest coins. No one wasted it on floors. No one used it on boots. It was for hands, faces, perhaps a cloth you wanted to wear at a wedding, or a baby's wrap that had known too much sorrow. Sometimes they didn't use it at all. They kept it, opened the cloth now and then, smelled it, closed it again, not because they were afraid to lose it, but because, for a moment, it reminded them that softness existed. The soap itself had a story, made from lard and oil, oiled with ash, and stirred in heavy pots by servants whose names were not written down. It was pressed into molds, stamped with crests, wrapped in waxed paper, and tied with ribbon. Then used by fingers that had never known hunger, but once forgotten, once cast aside. It became something holier because it fell into hands that needed it, hands that washed not for vanity, but for mercy. Some said it healed, cracked skin made smooth, infections eased, confidence returned. Maybe it did, maybe not, but it felt like it. And feelings, in a world like that, were half the battle. The soap of the Lord's kitchen became legend. Girl who married said she used it on her wedding morning. A boy saved a piece to clean his hands before his father's funeral. One woman claimed she used it on her dying child's feet so he'd smell like spring, even in winter. And no one doubted her, because the soap did not just clean, it comforted. It told you, in scent, in touch, in lather, that the world held moments of grace, that there was beauty, even here, even now. Of course, it didn't last. Nothing did. Soon, it shrank, crumbled, was used up bit by bit, until all that remained was the memory. But they kept the cloth it was wrapped in, washed it, folded it gently. And when they touched it, it still felt like a blessing. The manor would send more, perhaps, or not. It didn't matter, because by then they had remembered how to make their own, not the same, but enough, a lump of soap made from bone fat and old oil, mixed with herbs from the hedge, dried on a board near the fire. It didn't smell like lavender, but it worked, and more importantly, it was theirs. So when someone knocked, when a neighbor said, "Do you have any left?" they didn't hoard it. They shared. Because soap, once passed through many hands, stopped being property. Asterisk, it became memory. It became community. And the story was told again. Once we had soap from the manor. It smelled like flowers. It made the water dance. It made me feel like I was someone. And the children listened, and the fire cracked. The basin steamed. And for a moment, everything felt a little more possible. The broom was not just for dirt. It was for rhythm, for reclaiming space, for saying, "This is where we live." Even when the wind blew through the cracks and the floor never truly dried. Each morning, someone swept. Not because they believed the house could be clean, but because it could be cared for. And there's a difference, Dot. It began with corners. That's where the cold gathered, and where yesterday's crumbs and dried leaves curled like secrets. The broom, usually birch or broomcorn tied with twine, moved like a soft arm, brushing away the small disrespects of life. But then, sometimes it turned to the body, because when there was no hot water, no basin ready, no time to scrub, the broom became something more. A tool not just for floorboards, but for skin. A dry brushing. A ritual. A quick flick down the back. Sweep across the legs, the arms, the back of the neck. Dot. It was never spoken of as hygiene. It was just something people did, Dot, to wake the blood. To lift the layer of sleep or stillness or sweat. To start again. Children laughed when it was their turn. The bristles tickled. The broom was too big for them anyway. But they stood still, squirming, giggling, as the strokes came down their backs like gusts of wind. Out. And when it was done, they'd say, again. Not because they were dirty, but because it felt like kindness. Adults didn't laugh, but they didn't protest either. Dot. It was quick. It helped Dot, and in a world without lotions or showers or warm towels, that was enough. The idea was simple. The skin sheds. The body carries. And sometimes it needs help letting go. Not a full bath, not a scouring. Just a soft removal of the day. Dot. It felt good, in the quiet way that most good things did. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. A woman might sweep her own arms with a broom before dressing, just once down each side. A man might stand by the door after work and let his son brush the back of his tunic, and then his back, too. Just a few strokes, not for appearance, for feeling. Sometimes a bundle of herbs was added to the broom. Dried thyme, mint, lavender, if the year had been generous. Not enough to scent the room, but enough to scent the breath when the bristles stirred the air. And the body, touched by straw and leaves, believed, just a little, that it was being healed. Dot. It wasn't exfoliation. It wasn't medicine. Dot. It was care. A kind of care that said, I see you, even when the skin was rough, even when the muscles ached, even when no one had touched you gently in days. Some called it nonsense. Old ways. Superstition. Dot. But they still let it happen. They still stood still, arms loose, eyes closed, as someone brushed them down like a horse after labor. And afterward, they felt lighter. Dust in the air, straw on the floor, and a body that felt more like a body again, not just a tool. In winter. It was done closer to the fire. The bristles dried too quickly. The static sparked on wool sleeves, but the warmth made it better. The broom moved over warm skin, and the skin did not flinch. It relaxed. Sometimes, after a fight, someone would sweep another, without words, a soft act that said, let's begin again. And the broom would lift the invisible heaviness. The weight no one wanted to name. No oils were applied afterward. No perfumes. Only a clean tunic, a soft sigh, and maybe the comfort of movement. Some brooms were kept just for that, not for floors, not for ashes, only for bodies. Hung beside the door, tied with red thread, passed down like recipes. And when the bristles wore thin, as they always did, someone would weave a new one, carefully, lovingly, because even the smallest rituals deserved renewal. It wasn't about staying clean. It was about feeling whole. Didn't do it to impress. You did it to reconnect. To remember that you weren't just labor. You were also skin, also breath, also a being worthy of gentle touch. In some homes, the brushing came before bed, especially for the elderly, to soothe the body, to help sleep arrive. A daughter brushing her mother's arms, a son brushing his father's back. The strokes slow, downward, reassuring. No words, just rhythm dot, like the sweeping of the floor, like the sound of rain, like forgiveness dot, and when the broom was set down and the bristles cooled, and the skin felt new again. There was peace, not because the body was different, but because it had been seen, cared for, tended, and in the stillness that followed, as the fire dimmed and the straw shifted beneath your spine, you could finally exhale dot, not clean, but clear dot, and sometimes that was all you needed. They didn't have doctors. Not the kind that carried tools in velvet bags or wore gloves that smelled of ointments. They had old women with stories, men with boiled roots, and sweat, they believed could pull the sickness out dot, so when someone fell ill with a fever that clung or a cough that wouldn't leave, the house changed dot, windows were sealed, the fire was stoked higher, blankets piled on the body like earth over seed, and then they waited dot. The goal wasn't comfort. It was heat dot to make the body melt, drip, release whatever poison it had taken in. The sweat bath didn't need water. It needed fire and stillness, and a patience born from watching others survive the same. They rubbed the chest with goose fat or onion paste. They laid cloths soaked in vinegar on foreheads. They whispered prayers as they pressed damp rags to lips. Gone too dry dot, and then they covered you again. Layer after layer, wool, linen, sheepskin if they had it. You didn't fight the sweat. You welcomed it. You let it pour from your skin, like grief. You let the fever speak and then burn out. There were bowls near the bed, not for drinking, for catching the sickness. If you vomited, it was seen as a good sign. The body pushing the wrongness out. The air was thick, with heat, with breath, with the smell of sickness, metallic, sweet, earthy. But no one flinched, because they had smelled it before, and they knew the only way out was through. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Sometimes they sang low, slow songs that didn't ask for harmony, just presence. A mother would sing to a child who was sweating through his only shirt, a sister to a brother who hadn't spoken in days, a wife to a husband whose hand barely twitched. The songs didn't promise healing, but they promised, I'm here. And that was something. Herbs were burned too. Juniper, yarrow, rosemary dot, not because they cured, but because they smelled like memory, like the world outside the bed. Like better days dot, the sweat would come in waves. First the shimmer on the brow, then the drops down the spine, then the soaked blanket, clinging like a second skin. And still, they covered you. Let it run, they'd say. Let it break you. Because that was the only way the healing began. There were other ways to sweat. 2 dots sometimes. They built makeshift saunas, of sorts. A tented corner near the fire. Stones heated in flame, dropped into a basin. Water poured, steam rising like a spirit. The sick were placed inside, naked or nearly, alone or watched by someone who knew the signs dot. It wasn't luxury. It was war, against whatever cold had crept in, against the ache that didn't speak its name. They'd emerge flushed, trembling, wrapped in furs or blankets, made to drink boiled water, sometimes bitter, always hot dot. Then they'd sleep, and the family would wait, because the next morning would tell you everything. Did the fever break? Was the pillow dry? Did the cough sound looser? Did the eyes open with something behind them? If yes, there was joy. Quiet, reverent joy dot. If no, then they tried again and again, because sweat was faith. You couldn't see it curing, but you believed it might, and in that belief there was power. The sweat bath wasn't just for the body. It was for the heart. It was for the people who loved you. It gave them something to do, a reason to stay close dot, and so they stayed. They brought warm broth. They wiped brows, They changed linens, if there were any to change. They caught the sweat in cloths, held it like proof, felt its warmth like a pulse. Sometimes the room smelled of herbs. Sometimes it smelled of death. But they stayed, because leaving meant giving. Up, and that was never done lightly. When someone recovered, the room was cleaned. Blankets beaten, straw changed. The sweat rinsed from the basin with water scented by mint or pine. And the sick, now better, sat outside, pale, thin, but grateful for the wind on their face. They'd sit there for hours, wrapped in whatever hadn't been used during the ill. Fever, watching birds, remembering breath, and someone, a child, a sibling, a neighbor, would say, "You're better," not as fact, but as blessing. And the person would nod dot because they knew what it meant to sweat and survive. Some never did. Some bodies stopped before the sweat could start. Too cold, too tired, too full of ache dot, and the room was cleaned anyway, not for sanitation, but for sorrow. The cloths were burned, the herbs scattered, the sweat left to dry in the air, and someone sat where the body once lay, remembering the heat. That wasn't enough, but most times, they pulled through. They lived. They got up. They ate bread. They laughed again. And they didn't thank the herbs, or the broth, or the prayers dot. They thanked the sweat, quietly, softly, like a secret, because it had carried them through, like a river made of the self. And in that sweat, there was something stronger than illness. There was the will to remain. They were the last to be washed. Always. Feet came after the face, after the hands, after the shoulders and scalp and back. They waited, half forgotten, half endured, at the end of every cleaning, because they were farthest from the fire, farthest from the eyes, farthest from concern dot, but they carried everything dot mud, calluses, cracks so deep they bled without being noticed. And still they were pressed into frost and straw and stone without complaint. Peasant feet were not dainty. They were thick, broad, sun-darkened in summer and chapped ash-gray in winter. Toenails yellowed, thickened, heels split, and between the toes, always something hiding. Washing them wasn't just an act of hygiene. It was a confrontation. You had to look down at what carried you, what bore the weight of your life, and that wasn't easy. Got water was rarely warm by then. The fire had cooled, the basin's heat long spent on better parts. So you sat, tired, body wrapped in drying rags, and let your feet sink into the lukewarm memory of comfort. If you were lucky, someone helped. A child, a spouse, an elder who remembered what it was like to bend. They poured water over ankles black. With soil, they rubbed gently, or not gently at all. They pulled off crusted stockings. They clipped toenails with small knives, eyes squinting in candlelight dot, and in that moment, you were vulnerable. Because nothing says, "I'm human," more than letting someone touch your feet. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Children's feet told their own stories. Solace bruised from climbing trees barefoot, toes stubbed on roots and rocks, sometimes swollen, sometimes wrapped in rags too tight, because that's what was available. Mothers noticed the limp before the child did, and they washed the wound. Asterisk pressed a cloth to the swelling, held the foot in their lap like something holy, because it was. Feet were holy in the way that bread was, simple, overused, and essential. Shoes, when they existed, were not made for comfort. Wooden clogs, leather scraps laced with string. Sometimes nothing at all, just hardened skin and quick steps. Man could walk 5 miles before sunrise, barefoot, and never think to complain, because the feet were not for luxury. They were for getting their dot, and so they cracked and bled. and twisted in ways they shouldn't have. And still, they got you to the stream, to the barn, to the grave. Some tied cloth between toes to ease the pain. Others stuffed straw into their boots to keep them from rubbing raw. One woman was known for boiling bark, letting her feet soak in the bitter brown water. She said it pulled the ache out, and maybe it did sometimes. During long winters, the cold crept in through the soles. Not through the door, not through the walls, through the floor, and the feet were the first to feel it, the first to lose their color, the first to go numbed out. People would sit close to the fire, feet outstretched, toes curled like fingers trying to grasp a dream. The heat came slowly, painfully. The tingling, the sting, the pulse returning like a hammer, but no one pulled away. Because to feel again, even pain, was better than frost at night, feet tangled beneath wool and hay, warmed only by proximity. Children slept side by side, their feet pressed together like little prayers. And the old, they wrapped theirs in cloth soaked in vinegar, pressed against stones heated by fire, whispering to them as if they could hear, "Don't leave me tonight." Because feet gone cold for too long don't always come back. Washing them was a ritual of last resort, done when smell demanded, done when infection threatened, but also, sometimes, done as an act of love. A mother washing her husband's feet as he returns from harvest. A girl washing her grandmother's feet, kneeling on the packed dirt floor. A father washing a child's feet when the fever breaks. The cloth moved in circles. The water darkened. The room quieted because in that moment there was no work, no past, only skin and water and silence. Some said it healed. That touching feet, caring for them, was like grounding the soul. Others said it humbled you, made you remember where you came from. Not from kings or saints, but from earth, from walking, from bruised soles and bare ground. There were folk, tales too, of spirits who licked your feet in the night if you didn't wash them, of fairies who braided your toes together in your sleep if you left them dirty, of saints who wandered the roads, disguised as barefoot beggars, blessing the homes of those who offered to clean their feet so children were taught. Even if you forget to wash your face, don't forget your feet. And when death came, the feet were washed first. Not for the mourners, for the journey, because whatever came next, it was respectful to arrive with clean steps. And so the feet were bathed, the nails trimmed, the heels wiped, and the toes kissed by cloth. It was the last. Kindness, given when no other could be. And maybe that's why they were always coldest, because they bore it all and said nothing. They didn't call it dental care. There were no gleaming smiles in polished mirrors, no floss, no rinse, no little cups lined in neat rows. But the mouth still mattered, because breath carried more than air. It carried closeness. It carried hunger. It carried words meant to last longer than a loaf of bread. So people tended to their teeth, quietly, and with what they had. It began with twigs, soft, fraying ends bitten, until they split into bristles. Hazel, willow, sometimes birch, chewed, then used to scrub. Not perfectly, not thoroughly, but enough. The twigs bent to the shape of the mouth, moved over teeth like a whisper, dislodged what lingered, scraped away the ache before it could deepen into something darker. They didn't always call it cleaning. They called it freshening, soothing, something done before a prayer, something done after waking or before sleep if there was time. Some dipped the twigs in salt, others in soot, or crushed herbs. Mint if it grew nearby, fennel seeds, dried, rosemary leaves ground between stones until they turned into something you could press into the tongue. There were no rinses, just a sip of water, or the taste of vinegar from a cloth left two near the pickling pot. But the breath could be sweet, not from sugar, but from survival, because a clean mouth meant you'd eaten, meant you'd been seen, meant you might smile without apology. Not if you're enjoying this pace already. Leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Toothaches came for everyone, not just the poor, but they stayed longer here because there were no dentists in the village, just old women with needles, men with iron tools and steady hands. A tooth that rotted too far had to come out, pulled, without blessing, without numbness, without relief. Sometimes a string, sometimes a knife, always a rag to bite down on, always someone holding your shoulders, whispering, "Stay, just a little more." Afterward, there was pain, and quiet, and a mouth that felt like lost. So people tried to prevent it, not with rituals, but with habits. Children were taught to chew bark, to rub their gums with cloth, to pick food from their teeth with straw or bone slivers. A kiss meant more when you didn't carry last night's stew with it. And so they tried. Teeth were not white, not straight, but they were cared for. In the way you care for the floor, by sweeping it. In the way you care for a wound, by covering it. Not perfection, just attention. Sometimes they boiled herbs and swished the water. Other times they chewed cloves, rare, expensive, but powerful. They said it numbed the pain, and it did. A woman might carry one in her apron. For the day she felt the ache begin behind her molar. For the night her child couldn't sleep from the pounding in his jaw. Tooth pain didn't whisper, it screamed, and the household listened. They wrapped faces in cloth, pressed warm stones to cheeks, tied bandages under the chin, over the crown, a makeshift cradle for pain. And still, they chewed, because eating was not a choice. It was life. So teeth, even when cracked or crooked, had to endure. The lucky ones grew old with most of them. The rest adapted, learned to chew with the side that hurt less, learned which soups didn't sting, learned silence when smiling hurt. There were stories, of course, of men who had all their teeth at 60, of women who could bite through leather, of children born with a single white tooth already in their jaw, a sign, they said, of a sharp mind or a short life. But mostly, teeth were quiet until they weren't, and in that silence you learned how to care for them. Some households had a shared toothpick, carved bone, kept clean mostly, passed from hand to hand after meals like a tool of peace. It wasn't disgusting. It was ordinary, because no one had the luxury of disgust. They were too busy surviving. So a twig in the mouth wasn't odd. It was daily, part of waking, part of resting. And when you saw someone sitting by the fire, eyes half closed, turning out, stick slowly between their teeth, you didn't interrupt. You nodded. You let them finish, because that was their moment of care, of self, of smallness made sacred. At weddings, breath mattered. At funerals, too. And so people chewed herbs, held them on the tongue, spoke gently, whispered blessings that didn't carry the scent of meat or garlic or last week's beer. The breath was made clean, not for beauty, but for presence. And sometimes, in the stillest moments, when a child climbed into a mother's lap, when a lover leaned close after hours in the field, the breath mattered more than the words, because it said, "I'm here. I'm whole. I haven't forgotten how to care." Clean meant different things in different seasons, not by choice, by necessity. Winter didn't allow it. Not really. Water froze in buckets. Steam curled into cold air and vanished before it touched your skin. To wash was to risk, not discomfort, but illness. So winter was for wiping, for brushing, for doing the best you could without making things worse. You cleaned your hands near the fire. You cleaned your face with snow. If you were brave. Your feet were hidden in wool and prayers. Blankets held the smell of sleep and smoke and skin. But you didn't change them often, because who could dry cloth in a frozen world? You learned to love the smell of warmth, even if it was mixed with something human, because warmth meant life. Come spring, everything changed. The thaw arrived like grace. Water moved again. The ground softened. The wind no longer bit. It brushed. And suddenly, the idea of washing became possible again. Not a burden, but a hope. People aired out their homes, opened shutters, beat rugs with sticks, hung clothes across hedges and branches like flags of new beginnings. Children were the first to be washed. In buckets, in streams, in puddles. Their laughter returned with the sun, and women followed, scrubbing their arms, their necks, their backs, letting the winter fall off in gray ribbons of old skin. Clothes were boiled, rags were replaced, beds were turned. The whole world turned. Spring was for forgiveness. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. By summer, cleanliness took on new weight. Sweat, mud, dust. The body became something to tend daily, not yearly. Washing happened often, even if just with a cloth and a bowl. You rinsed your face 3 times a day. You poured water over your feet at dusk. You sat by the stream and let it talk to you as you scrubbed your arms clean. And still, you never stayed dry, because sweat returned as quickly as it left. But in summer, no one minded. You wore less. You bathed more. You laughed louder. You washed not just for decency, but for relief. Herbs were easier to find. Soapwort bloomed. Mint was crushed and rubbed into wrists. People smelled better, even if they didn't try to. The sun dried your hair. The breeze aired your linen.